and welcome to What the Fringe, the podcast dedicated to all things Fringe theater. I'm your host, Lauren Hantz, and each week I visit with a Fringe artist to hear all about their endeavors and gain insight into their process. This week I'm visiting with Steve Budde of Oi, What They Said About Love. Steve Budde wonders why other people can tie the knot and he can't. Oy, does he wonder. So he asked a bunch of couples what brought them together and keeps them from pulling apart. Meet a Jewish couple who met on Craigslist, an interfaith pair who met at a Halloween party, and more. Budde plays close to a dozen characters using their own words taken from hours of interviews and weaves in his relentless search for the one. Check out the newest mashup of personal storytelling and documentary theater from award-winning solo performer who sparkles with manic and irrepressible charm.
I know I didn't want to be doing caricatures. I wasn't just going easy. I wanted to treat my interviewees with respect in a sense. Not that I'm playing my interviewees, because the character, I'm very much, there might be some hint of the person I interviewed in what I'm playing, or I might take some inspiration from the person I interviewed, but in some cases not, where it's really, I'm creating a character that has very little to do with the person I interviewed, except for I'm using their words, So basically wanted to feel some, loyalty to my interviewees and wanting to represent them well and not make fun of them, but also not play caricatures.
Steve Budde is an actor, writer, stand-up comic, and award-winning solo performer living in Oakland, California. Steve has trained at the Marsh in San Francisco and with the Groundlings in Los Angeles, and has performed in Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Israel at theaters such as the San Francisco Playhouse, Marin Shakespeare Company, New Conservatory Theater Center, the Theater at Monmouth, and the English Theater Company of Israel. He is a college professor of English and drama. His solo shows, What They Said About Love and Seeing Stars, have enjoyed lengthy runs at the Marsh and delighted audiences around the country and abroad. Steve, welcome to What the Fringe.
Thank you, Lauren. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got connected because we're both performing at the San Diego Fringe here in May. And I was, looking for people to have on the podcast and looking at your show, and it looked really fun. And then I saw some clips of you kind of popping in and out of characters. I don't know if you did speech and debate. I did speech and debate in high school, and that's what we called it. Speech and debate. Did you do that?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, that is a whole nother podcast in and of itself, but we would call popping characters, where you go back and forth between the two. And I was super impressed with how you would kind of transition back in between your characters. And I was like, I want to have this guy on and talk to him. So
thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's first talk about your journey as an artist. When did the acting bug get you? When were you theater, this is it? What I want to do with my life?
It's a good question. I think I had musical theater desires when I was in high school, but it didn't seem appropriate at the time. No, actually, I used to play trumpet. And so I was in the bands and all that stuff. And then I did actually audition for Fiddler on the Roof when I was a sophomore in high school. And I was hoping for one of the kind of main parts, but I was just put in the chorus, which was fine. I was one of the guys out there singing. At 3, I started Hebrew school. At 10, I learned a trade. So, I did that and then never did another musical again in high school, or I didn't act at all in college. I kind of thought about it a bit in college. And in fact, I did a semester abroad in London. And I think that's where I really got the bug, going to amazing theater for the first time in my life. I grew up in the Boston area. I can't remember if at that point I had been to Broadway and seen anything on Broadway. I'm sure I'd seen a couple touring shows in Boston, but seeing just incredible theater in London, what I remember standing out particularly was an Arthur Miller play, All My Sons, and maybe there was some homesickness there, seeing America on the stage, when I was in London, something about that. But I was like, wow, I want to be up there. I mean, there's a lot of all that father-son stuff. I guess I've always been a sucker for that, having had somewhat challenging relationship with my dad, I guess. So for me, seeing the father-son stuff play out in All My Sons, and then other plays too. I saw a lot of plays while I was in London. Just gave me this feeling wow, I don't know why. I want to be up there. I want to do that. And then I went back for another semester of college, and I actually auditioned for a play and got cast, and went to a few rehearsals and chickened out. I talked myself out of it.
What?
I know. I regret that, but for some silly reason, I was like, no, I gotta concentrate on my studies, which is ridiculous. And it was just, I guess I felt scared, so I didn't. And then it took until I was 25, I started taking acting classes in the Boston area. First intro to acting, and then scene study, all that stuff you do, and then started auditioning and getting cast when I was 26. So I was like, wow, I guess I must have some kind of knack for this stuff if they're actually casting me. Either that or there's just so few guys auditioning that they're desperate, which might have been more the case. But I think I learned a lot by being able to get out there and not do a very good job, but learn and get better as I went along.
Oh, that's a really fun story. I just love how the theater called to you, and it probably seems like very magical there in London, seeing such wonderful, beautiful theater. So did you ever travel to New York to see theater, like when you were younger and when you were in Boston?
I mean, once at that age, I did once in a while, once I got into my 20s. Before that, I may have during college. I remember I have a memory of seeing something with Marlee Matlin. I don't know if it was Kiss of the Spider Woman. I'm trying to think what she was in. No, that probably wasn't.
But you saw her on Broadway.
Yeah. And I think it was during college, but I can't remember the play. Other than that, I would have seen like touring shows in Boston, like Godspell, Jesus Christ Superstar. Trying to think what else I might have seen. Sort of a Broadway type production in the Boston area, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. Oh, so fun. And now here you are, years later, teaching.
Yeah.
The guy who couldn't go on stage with the show that he was actually cast in. That's great.
I know.
That's a good story. What show was it? Do you remember?
I do. It's called Private Wars.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's Vietnam vet, like 3 Vietnam vets in like a VA hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just sort of like, peace out, not doing it.
Yeah, which, that was silly. I wish I had. Who knows if I would have sucked or been decent, or good. I don't know. I'll never know. We'll never know.
Never know. You can't go back in time. But now you are. You're wonderful. You're super successful. And you have this really great story. It's just part of your journey.
That's right. Exactly.
So you've done a lot of improv as well. You trained with the Groundlings. And how would you say, like, improv, how has that shaped you as a performer?
I think, getting some improv training was super important. I have to say, it's kind of out of my comfort zone. It's not because I want to be, I guess, because of the perfectionistic side of me, I want to be prepared. I want to be practiced. I want to know what I'm doing when I go out there. I want it to seem effortless. And I do, once in a while, I'll hit it just right in improv because it's just like a character. I have a comfort level, I guess. But in general, I feel like I shut myself down too much because I'm like nervous of saying not being funny or interesting or whatever. That being said, it was great training because I was in class, and also I was in like a training program where we got to perform, I think, once a month for an actual audience in San Francisco. It was a group up here I worked with at the time called Lila Theater. And so being up, kind of thrown into the fire, as a performer, it was a great experience. It's like working muscles that I hadn't worked before. And, as you know, like improv is basically the heart of good acting. It doesn't matter if it's scripted and rehearsed. It's like you want it to be fresh every time you're out there. And that basically comes down to playing yes and being in the moment. And it's like you've never done it before, even though you have. So improv is so important. And I'm glad I did that training. And I'm glad I did stand-up, too, because even though I'm not really doing it now, haven't done much really since COVID. Several years there, I was getting out there with some regularity. And I think, again, it was like working a certain muscle that also then kind of led me to solo performance.
Oh, so the stand-up led you into writing your own shows and like kind of fringe work. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Oh, talk to me about that. Like what interested you like in doing that and like sharing your story?
I mean, I had done a lot of theater at that point. I was, saw myself as an actor, like any actor, just go out and audition and get cast and be in some really good productions and some not so good ones and this and that. But then I also wanted to do stand up. And at that point, I wasn't doing that much acting, but I wanted to be on stage and without having to deal with all the rehearsals and an extended run. So stand-up had been something I'd always wanted to try, and I always thought I was funny and wanted to see if that was true. I was never the class clown, but I guess I wanted to be, or I was the guy in the back who would say something under my breath and the people around me would crack up.
Nice.
And I have an MFA in creative writing that I got picked up along the way at Boston University, so that, I always had the writing thing. And so I kind of put it together first with stand-up. And it wasn't like a straight line from stand-up to solo performance, but I think along the way I saw the work of Anna Devere Smith. I saw her show, The Riots in the Aftermath of the Rodney King trials in LA. What was it called? Twilight LA. Seeing that got me really excited about doing that kind of work, playing multiple characters and building a show from interviews. So that was really my kind of goal. And also when I moved to the Bay Area 20 years ago from Boston, I realized there was a much better solo scene, an active solo scene in the Bay Area that there really wasn't much of in the Boston area at that time anyway. So I was like, wow, there's this place called The Marsh. It's a great theater that's been around now for something like, 35 years that specializes in solo performance, and you can take classes there and hopefully, so I started taking classes there close to 20 years ago. And then, had this goal, of course, having a main stage show that would run for hopefully several weeks. And it took me like 10 years to get there, or maybe a little more. But I did finally get there. First, I put together this show, What They Said About Love, not to be confused with my current show, Oi, What They Said About Love.
Oi!
Oi! Well, anyway, I put together What They Said About Love that I did it was my first full-length show that I did at the San Francisco Fringe. Convenient, since I live in the Bay Area. It's pretty easy to cross the Bay and perform over there. That was in 2016, and then took it down to the Hollywood Fringe the next year. And meanwhile, showed it. People from the Marsh saw it. I got to show it to their artistic director, Stephanie Weissman, and she liked it. But she said, I was kind of following the Anna Devere Smith playbook, where I interviewed a lot of people about their marriages, and I was playing all these couples talking about their relationship and interacting with each other, going back and forth between husband and wife. Also, I'd interviewed some singles, so I had a couple singles woven in, and a tiny bit of me, but of my story, but hardly any. And she was like, great, but you really have to put yourself into it because it's such a personal subject. And, it's not like the big kind of social subjects that Anna Devere Smith tackles. It's a very personal thing. And it'll give it more of a dramatic arc if your story is in the show. So first, I resisted it. I wasn't thrilled about that. I liked it the way it was, and I felt like that was my vision, that I wanted to create a show from interviews. But I was like, well, I do want a show at the Marsh. Well, it's worth a try, right? So I went back to with working with my director and going back to my desk and rewriting the piece and weaving in, picking up one particular relationship of mine from the past, a pursuit of a particular love interest, and weaving that in. And sure enough, it made for a better show, gave it a lot more of a dramatic arc, and ended up getting the run at the Marsh. And it got extended a couple times and had a nice long run. And that's, I guess, winter, spring, summer of 2018.
So you made the changes to What They Said About Love, because I was about to say, I was like, wow, that's impressive. You did a run and now you're taking it to Fringe. But I see. You did some Fringes, got some feedback, which is always hard to hear as an artist when somebody's like, it's great, but you need to do X, Y, and Z. And that's, as the artist, you have to go, either I take that advice or I don't, and, I find I take advice from people that I really, really trust. And even in the creation of my show, and you kind of have like a little bit of the opposite. I had people tell me, you can't do X, Y, and Z. And, there were some different things that I was wanting to do with the audience. And it just made me double down even harder on like my choices. Cause I was like, I don't agree with you. And I love this choice. And it made it stronger. So it's very interesting that someone gave you the feedback and you were like, actually, I really want to be at the Marsh. And then that feedback, instead of like doubling down and going, no, I'm just going to do interviews, it's a little bit of the opposite, and it made it better.
You're basically telling me I caved.
No!
I'm a sellout. Is that what you're saying, Lauren?
Absolutely not.
It is tough. We have to have thick skins as performers, and you can't listen to everybody. Some people are wrong about the advice, and it's hard to tell sometimes. But in this case, I think she was right, and it made for a better show. And since the shows that I've created since then, based on interviews like What They Said About Sex, I've basically followed that same formula of weaving in my own story along with the interviews.
Yeah, it's great advice too. And it's just, I think it's good for artists to hear sometimes like that. Sometimes you need to double down, and sometimes, you need to go back to the drawing board. And I had somebody give me a comment, because I have a little like choose your own adventure thing. And I have a friend who's a storyteller that I really admire their work, and was asked them what they thought. And they were like, why don't you just pick the best stories? And I was like, because that's not what I want to do. But I realized that I had not made it clear why I had this kind of choice thing going on in the show. And so there was a line that wasn't working. So I changed the line. And then the next festival I went to, I had a review. And the only line she quoted from the show was the line that I changed. And so I was like, okay, they knew what they were talking about. And I, as the artist, take it and go, I take your feedback and I'm going to make it what I want, and that's what you've done as well. You I take that feedback and I'm going to do that. And so it makes it stronger, I guess. Anyway, you're not a sellout, Steve, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Lauren.
Not at all. You are a bright, intelligent artist who looked at the art and goes, let's give it a try. And you did. And there it went. So I try not to offend my guests. I'm so sorry.
I try not to take offense, but no.
You're like, but you were so rude. So I just had to.
I was teasing you, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're having good fun. So I am kind of curious because I mean, we've got the theme, right? What they said about love, what they said about sex, what they said about love. Is it like a trilogy in some ways? Or like, are they connected or do they just happen to have similar titles?
I think all of that is true. They do have similar titles because they're all built from interviews, and then I weave in my own story. But through the process of doing that, they are, in some sense, a trilogy of telling more of my life story through these avenues.
Yeah. Oh, well, and then when did if you don't mind, I'd love to talk about Seeing Stars. I'm sure that's kind of a very deeply personal show for you. Where in the timeline did Seeing Stars happen?
So first was What They Said About Love, and then What They Said About Sex, and then Seeing Stars, which I think, when did I see? I'm trying to think when I did Seeing Stars first, probably at a Fringe festival, San Diego, perhaps. I could be wrong. I might have done the. Yeah, I guess I did San Diego first. That's San Diego Fringe, and then I had the run at the Marsh last summer after the San Diego Fringe of Seeing Stars. Yeah. That's it. There's no interviews in that. That was all a family story of basically my dad's mental health crisis like 30 years ago, where he had a manic episode like out of the blue when he was around 62 and ended up in a psych hospital for a couple months, and kind of the impact that had on our family and me in particular, since I'm really the star of the show. But my dad's probably the most interesting character in the show.
You play multiple characters in that show as well. You kind of use that same vehicle.
Yes. Probably not as many, but I play my mom, my dad, me, and then some minor characters, including Dolph Lundgren.
That is so fun. What draws you to wanting to play all of these multiple characters? Because that's your vehicle for storytelling, really, as we look at all four of your pieces, your solo shows. What's interesting to you about that?
It's funny. It was initially daunting and kind of scary, like with What They Said when I first created my first show, What They Said About Love, realizing I had to play all these characters. And I hadn't seen myself as a character actor. I don't think I was really perceived that way when I was getting cast in plays for whatever the 15, 20 years before I got into solo, So it was like, well, it was a couple of times where I suppose in some plays I had to play 2 or 3 different characters. There were occasions like that, but nothing that major, nothing that seemed like such a huge stretch. And so this was like, wow, how am I going to play that like a dozen characters? How can I do that? And play women too? And differentiate between all these couples? I don't know. But just, through working with directors and some coaches who were particularly good at working on characters and develop them using physicality, et cetera, and also vocal changes, I was like, wow, I enjoyed doing it and went over well. I loved it. So I'm like, okay, I guess I can do this. And it's a great way to tell stories. It's more fun than just being me out there. So that's kind of how it all happened.
Yeah, well, the videos, I think there was one video on your website, and that was what I watched. I was watching you pop in your characters, and you play your women so well. I was actually very impressed. And it's hard to impress me, is what I'm saying. But I think men playing women can get cliched or campy or caricature-y. And from the clips that I saw, they looked very honest and real. And I'm trying to think how many times I've seen men play women, but there was another show, Brad McIntyre's show, The Beast of Hyperborea, where his actor plays a female as well. I was blown away by that. And when I was watching your video, like I had the same reaction of like, just how blown away I was by that. So how did you guys, like you and your directors, kind of work through that to play the honesty of the women without like caricaturing them or, that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I know I didn't want to be doing caricatures. I wasn't just going for easy. I wanted to treat my interviewees with respect in a sense. Not that I'm playing my interviewees, because the character, I'm very much, there might be some hint of the person I interviewed in what I'm playing, or I might take some inspiration from the person I interviewed, but in some cases not, where it's really, I'm creating a character that has very little to do with the person I interviewed, except for I'm using their words, So basically wanting to feel some, I guess, loyalty to my interviewees and wanting to represent them well and not make fun of them, but also not play caricatures. Like as an actor, I'm not that interested in, as an audience member, I'm not that interested in seeing caricatures. As an actor, I don't really want to be doing that, So I think part of that, because that was my intention, that what I went in with, and I have directors who, that's also their intention. So I worked with David Ford and Mark Kenward from the Bay Area, excellent directors. Mark's also an excellent solo performer himself. But David Ford and Mark Kenward, both, especially David, connected with the Marsh. They also, encourage that kind of honesty and authenticity in the performance.
I think that's great advice. Always playing a character with authenticity is going to get you something nice. So you said, okay, so your characters are like it's a character that you've come up with, and maybe it's not like a representation of the person, but are you taking word for word the dialogue that you had with these people, or did you record, listen, and then go write something and dramatize it? Like, what did you do there?
Okay, I edited the transcripts, and then I picked and chose which parts and, shaped it, maybe moved things around, moved lines around. In some cases, changed some words, but it's pretty much 95% their words, what the people said. In some cases, I might have also taken lines from another interview that, where I wasn't going to use that interview, but I wanted to use a small part of it. So I took part of another interview and gave those lines to somebody else. So that's, kind of the extent of the changes.
That's really impressive, actually. I'm very, very impressed with that. So did you interview the same people for this trilogy, not trilogy of of shows? Or did you have just so many interviews from the first time and kind of scattered them throughout? Or how did that all work together?
Totally different people for what they said about sex. It was a whole different crop of interviewees. And then for what they went, when I decided to basically write a Jewish version of what they said about love and turned it into what they said about love, I went back to some of the people I'd interviewed before and got some follow-up information that would inform the show.
How many years apart from the interview times? That's super interesting.
Close to 10 years.
How had the people changed, or what, in the way that they spoke and what they thought about love? Did you see changes in them?
With the people I spoke to, I didn't see huge changes. I think one couple, they told me it didn't end up going into the show, but they're polyamorous now. Because some of the couples got divorced, but those I didn't actually end up interviewing. I didn't go back to those people. Some people passed away. I wasn't able to interview them. It wasn't going back and asking the same questions. When I came back for what they said about love, I had different questions that had to do with more how being Jewish informs their relationship. So I wasn't exactly saying, okay, tell me again how you met, or tell me again what irritates you about each other, or tell me again what you most love about each other. That would be cool to do. I have thought about doing that, especially now that it's been it was 2012. So 13 years since I did the first interviews for what they said about love. Yeah, it took me a while to get that show onto the stage, but it's been faster since then. Especially what they said about sex was faster journey, but I did a lot fewer. I got smart. I did a lot fewer interviews.
You refined the process. That totally happens with lots of folks. They get a lot faster and kind of what questions to ask and how it's going to fit together while you're talking to them and all of that. So other than seeing Anna Deavere Smith's show, what gave you the idea to talk about love? Why did you want to talk about that? Because we've got love and we've got sex, which are they're intertwined, right? So we're talking about these topics.
It was a couple things. One was I had just been in a relationship that I thought was going to lead me to the altar for the first time. I was like, wow, I'm finally going to get married. And it fell apart. It didn't happen. So I was like, wow, I'm 50. I'm 51, basically. What is my problem? how come I can't do this? Other people seem to be able to. It can't be. It's not brain surgery, is it?
It might be. It might be. Yeah. Yeah. You didn't get the brain surgery degree is what, yeah, they didn't. Nobody told you that.
So I thought maybe I could learn something by going to a bunch of married couples and asking them their process, like how their story of basically how they ended up married and how they make it work. And so I thought, well, hey, that could be a good solo show. That could be a good one-man show. And I would be doing it based on interviews. I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. So I started doing the interviews.
You started interviewing people and asking people about this topic before you had the idea for a show.
Well, I maybe not. I think I was simultaneous. I knew I wanted to create a show from interviews, but I didn't know exactly what. I thought about relationships, marriage, because I figured, that's always interesting to people and it can be entertaining the same way people love reading the vows section of the New York Times on Sundays. I'm like, I enjoy reading that stuff. So I'm like, well, everybody likes that stuff. Why not? And what else am I going to interview people about? I don't know. There's maybe sex lives. I don't know. Divorces, war, interview soldiers about their experience. Anyway, so I had different thoughts in my head, different ideas. And then, like I said, this relationship fell apart. And I thought, maybe it would be good for me actually to hear what people have to say about this. So I thought, okay, I'll start doing that.
And so now you've got Oi, What They Said About Love, which has a Jewish twist to it. So tell me, why did you decide to do this and now? What made you interested?
It's funny, I performed the show like probably 7 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. I performed the show for this older audience and a number of Jews in the audience. And one older guy came up to me after the show and said, how come you didn't really say anything about being Jewish? So that kind of planted the seed where I was like, yeah, that could be interesting material. Because I knew there was a lot of things about the particular relationship I'd focused on that I had kept out that did have to do with me being Jewish and her not. And so I thought that could actually be good material on a lot of levels, funny, but also serious. And also I knew a lot of the people I had interviewed for What They Said About Love were Jewish, or interfaith marriages, and I hadn't really asked them about that. So I thought I could go back, and then I'd have some of the show already in place, and then add some new parts, take out some of the old stuff, put in some new material, and have like a new show. I figured audiences would find it interesting, hopefully, general audiences, but also Jewish audiences.
Yeah. You've done this show. Where else have you done this show? Because you're doing San Diego, but that's not your premiere of it.
I guess I've done the show 6 times. 3 times last August for the San Francisco Fringe Festival, where it won Best of the Fringe, which was nice. And then a couple times in March at here, it's called the Best of SF solo series that Brian Copeland puts together. He's well known for his show, Not a Genuine Black Man. That's had like the longest run of any show in Marsh's history. It ran for, I think, over a year. He's a wonderful performer, and he puts on every year he puts on this series that he calls Best of SF solo series. So I got to be part of that. And then I mentioned to you, I guess, earlier offline, that I performed the show in Santa Monica at the Santa Monica Playhouse, part of what they call the BFF, the Binge Fringe Fest, where you get to come in and do your show once. And they have a whole series, festival that runs there for, I think, close to 3 months.
And how are audiences responding to Oi, What They Said About Love?
Well, I'm getting a really nice response from, laughs to people being moved to people saying it's the best show of mine that they've seen. So it's nice response.
What do you think is driving that? If they've seen your other shows and they're like, this is the best one? Because I would think that this show about your father was very personal, and people like to hear those. We like to get in the dirt and see what's going on. So why do you think they're feeling that way about this one?
God only knows. But I think one reason might be that I think this material is maybe the most commercial material of all my material. That What They Said About Love stuff is probably the most commercial, right? And, crowd, maybe I shouldn't say commercial. It's not like I'm making big bucks off it.
If you're making big bucks off Fringe, I want to see what you're doing.
I still hope to make big bucks off it someday. Anybody out there listening from Netflix or HBO, give me a call.
Exactly. Seriously.
But what they said about love and they're like crowd pleasers, I think because people love hearing about how people meet and marry and make things work. And there's they can see themselves in that. But sure, people really liked seeing stars, but it's also a little more challenging material, dealing with mental health, mental illness. So I think that's part of it. And I think then adding in the Jewish component for this show just added another piece of myself to it. So again, just helps bring it even more alive.
Now, you have had some success by taking your shows like to the Marsh, you've mentioned, which it seems like you had kind of an established relationship there with them, and they produce a lot of solo shows, but you've also toured your solo shows outside of Fringe, which is kind of what a lot of performers want to do. So what kind of advice can you give us on that? Or how did that happen? How are you booking these shows, beyond Fringe, if you will?
Back in 2019, I took What They Said About Love to a theater in London called the Canal Cafe Theater. It's a small theater, maybe seats about 50, above a pub, the Canal Cafe pub. I got to take my show there partly, through a woman who I know in the Bay Area. She's now elsewhere, but when she was here, she loved my show, and she has a connection to this theater in London and pitched the show for me, and they said sure. So I got to take it there for a couple weekends, and we did some fundraising. We had her and another producer kind of were able to raise some money, so I didn't lose money going there, and actually made a little, by going to London and having that fun experience of being able to perform there. Other times I've contacted theaters and asked them if I can, basically rented the theater and then found ways to promote it to hopefully fill the house and more than make my money back and make a profit on the show. And so part of that is just I guess being resourceful, thinking about probably the biggest theater I rented was in my hometown of Arlington, Massachusetts, a theater called the Regent Theater. When I was growing up there, it was a movie theater. Now it's a venue for live performance. And so I had met the guy, the artistic or managing director at APAP, the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. That conference, I did the conference in New York City in 2019. Met him, and then kept in touch. And then I followed that, I guess, later that year. I rented the theater for one show, was able to get a front page story about it in the local newspaper. So did a fundraiser in my mom's memory. She was a school teacher, had been a school teacher in the town. And so we did a fundraiser, tied it in for a fundraiser for a scholarship in her name.
That's beautiful. Well, I feel like what I'm hearing a lot is connections. And yeah. That's what this business is, right? Is just making those connections. And and honestly, they're all honest connections. We're we're not trying to use people by any means, but.
Although if we have to, life is connections.
Oi, what they said about using people.
That's my next show. What they said about using people. No, but I think, first of all, everything's connection. So much of life, it's of course, the old adage, it's not what you know, it's who you know. But in business is all about connections, politics, so many things are, getting an interview somewhere because you know somebody. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's good. It's human.
Okay, so we are getting close to our end. So I love to ask this question of all of my guests, my last question, which is, what is your most interesting or awkward Fringe interaction that you've ever had?
The most interesting or awkward?
Or, yeah, it can be anything. A funny little quippy story, if you will. Or it could be a memorable, a momentous thing that happened. I've had people tell very heartfelt stories in this moment.
Probably for me, it was when I did my first Fringe, when I first brought a solo show to the stage, which was 2016, when I performed an earlier version of What They Said About Love at the San Francisco Fringe. And I was scared. I had done a lot of acting at that point, but never, and I'd done some stand-up. The idea of being on stage by myself for an hour with a scripted show and, all the blocking and all the lighting changes and everything that was going on. Super nervous, before I went out to do that. And I remember going for a hike before, probably that morning, walking on this wooded trail near me in Oakland and breaking into tears. And I think it wasn't just nervousness. It was also just how much it meant to me. This thing I'd been wanting to do for 10 years, to perform a full-length solo show. And I was actually doing it. I wasn't just thinking about doing it like I'd done a lot in my life of various things, thinking about doing it. I'll get around to that someday. I actually did it, was doing it. I think that. And then, there were moments in that show, in those early, I guess it was 5 performances, I sold out, which was cool. I got, the most sold out shows, I think, of that run. Of course, it's easier when you live in the city than people from out of town, as we know. There were times when I went up in my lines, froze, had that moment or started walking toward one chair when I was supposed to be at another chair, for a particular character. But I caught all that stuff pretty quickly, and it's not like anybody really cares. And the show, regardless of that, came off well. And I just keep feeling more confident and a lot less nervous when I go out with a solo show now compared to 2016. So yeah.
Thanks for sharing that really sweet and tender story. I mean, that is, I think, how so many of us feel. It's like birthing. I've heard people talk about their shows. It's like birthing, even from people who have not been birthed things. But, it's like this thing that you've created and then you're putting it out there. And it's a lot. There's a lot of emotions mixed up in that. So it's a really beautiful story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, we don't have to stop talking, do we? Come on. Let's go for another.
I know. Well, we'll keep talking. The people don't get to hear all of our little conversations. All right. Well, Steve will be performing Oi, What They Said About Love at the San Diego International Fringe Festival this May, and then at the Ottawa Fringe Festival in June. You can learn more about Steve on his website, Steve Budd, that's BUDD.com, and keep up with him on Instagram at BudGram and on Facebook at Steve.Bud3 and on LinkedIn at BudSteve. What the Fringe is produced and hosted by me, Lauren Hantz. This episode was edited by Ben Ellis of Renowned Media, and those sweet tunes you hear are provided by Paul Snyder of Orchestra of Sound, and our logo was designed by Ruby Arnold of Ruby Makes Things. What the Fringe can be found on your favorite podcast platforms and now on YouTube. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know when new episodes release, and keep up with What the Fringe on Instagram at whatthefringe_productions, and find us online at whatthefringeproductions.com. Bud, I said that correctly, yes?
Yes.
Great. I have butchered people's names before, so there we go.
Well, it's actually Bude. It's Bude.
Bude.
It's bad.
Oh, jeez. How many acting exercises can we do saying your name? That was great.